77 years ago today, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled during the Nakba. Despite UN Resolution 194, over 7 million Palestinians remain displaced and unable to access, visit, or return to Palestine. But the Nakba is not in the past. With the genocide in Gaza and the continued systemic oppression of the Palestinian people, the Nakba is ongoing. This is not history repeating itself. It's the same crime still unfolding. This episode is dedicated to the memory of those who are displaced, to those who were lost, and to the resistance that never stopped. We honor their struggle. We carry their story.
The Nakba is a catastrophe that exists in our history, our hearts, our minds, and it's actually also a catastrophe that we're witnessing in present day. I hope that we continue to find community amongst each other because they're trying to finish the job of the Nakba. They have that old quote that the old will die and the young will forget. They're absolutely wrong about that. We're tired of having the target on our back, and we're going to build power until we liberate Palestine, inshallah.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit SumudPod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. Consider supporting our work through a contribution on the Support Us page. For nearly 2 months, Israel has blocked humanitarian aid trucks from entering Gaza, but the need for care hasn't stopped. UNRWA's mental health counselors are still there, supporting kids through trauma every single day. That's Sumud. On Saturday, May 31st, walk or run with Ed and the Sumud Podcast team at the Gaza 5K, an UNRWA USA fundraiser for refugee mental health, either in person at Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., or virtually from anywhere. Sign up at gaza5k.org and use the code SUMUD, S-U-M-U-D, at checkout for $10 off.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Ahmad Abuznaid. Ahmad is a Palestinian-American lawyer and executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. He doesn't just build bridges, he breaks chains. From Florida to Palestine, he fights for collective liberation, knowing freedom won't be handed down. It must be demanded, organized, and won. Welcome, Ahmad.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Ed.
How are you doing today?
It's Friday, alhamdulillah. We got some good news, right? We just heard of Maisa being ordered to be released. So it's good to get some bits of good news in the midst of all the bad news.
And by the time this episode airs, our objective is to have this go live on Nakba Day, the coming Thursday, the 15th. And by the way, I am representing you all today. I don't know if you saw Bria hook me up.
I did. That is one of our freshest of the fresh. I'm glad to see it.
Just in case people can't read it, I got it right behind me here too.
We appreciate that.
No, of course, of course. So you have a fascinating story. The only theme I could come up with about you really is this dude was just born to fight. He was just born to stand up against injustice from your early childhood. Where did that come from? Can you just give us some of your background?
First of all, I think that's a pretty cool thing. So thank you. I think if that's what's remembered of me one day, I'll feel really proud looking back. My father was a PLO organizer and activist. He ended up being obviously linked up with Fatah. The older generation, many of them sacrificed everything. Many of them had such a deep devotion and love for our people. And so even if it wasn't consciously for me, a decision to want to be like my father or want to follow in his footsteps, I do believe like watching him day to day, sort of engaged in this process of liberation for our people, I think that had a huge, profound impact on me subconsciously.
So you were born in Palestine, then you moved to the US, and then I think you moved at 1, and then you went back, was it age of 7? Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. My father was at the time a professor at Jamiat al-Khalil, Hebron University. And so my mother and I basically lived on our own in South Florida. I think my parents, just like many parents in that position, figured that we would be better off together. And so this separation wasn't really a great environment for the family, but also they wanted me to get an experience growing up in Palestine, meeting my family, learning about Palestine, learning about everything, and just knowing my people and who I am.
And talk about your experiences growing up in the West Bank and some of the challenges that you'd faced.
Well, when I first flew back to Palestine, age 7, I don't think my parents had any sort of conversation that could have prepared me for what would happen immediately upon landing, which is that we landed in Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport, and I noticed the signs that were dictating for Palestinians to go through a certain route, and then Israeli passport holders a different route. What that route led to is actually an interrogation room where myself and my mother had Israeli soldiers going through all of our luggage and then strip searching us. So literally, like within the first few moments of landing in what I was told was home, I was made to feel very unwelcome. And that was the first day. But then like you leave the airport and you drive out from built up Tel Aviv with its skyscrapers and, infrastructure. We drive out to Al Khalil, Hebron, where my family is from. And you start to see the lack of investment, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of paved roads, the lack of everything that you would expect to have in your neighborhoods and in your communities here in the US, and what I saw in Tel Aviv. That was just the first day, but like there's so many experiences that really stuck with me. A couple of other ones that I'll mention is that there was at some point in time an event organized by my father and some folks from the PLO, from Fatah, to welcome Jesse Jackson to Al Khalil. And I didn't know who Jesse Jackson was at the time. I just knew that he was someone important, and my father was working on his visit. And they had some kind of luncheon in Al Khalil. I remember very vividly being at the luncheon, seeing all these people surrounding Jesse Jackson and engaging with him. Then I remember there was a press conference immediately outside after the luncheon. And what I remember about that press conference was that it was interrupted by tear gas canisters. It was interrupted by IDF, basically showing their routine brutality against Palestinians doing anything organized. And I remember being rushed onto a bus. Actually, Jesse Jackson and his wife grabbed me. My parents ran onto the bus. I was grabbed and pulled onto the bus, and we got out of there. And I remember thinking, like, why? Like, why would that happen? Why was that a organized group of people that needed to be fired upon? As a young person living under occupation, you start to ask these questions. And another experience that for me caused me to ask many questions was the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre. In 1994, a settler from New York, Goldstein, ended up going into the Ibrahimi Mosque on one of the morning days during Ramadan, and people were gathered for Fajr prayers. So it was really early in the morning. He opened fire, murdering at least 30 Palestinian worshipers, injuring over 100 until he was tackled and subdued. And I remember when I heard about this incident, and we lived in Al Khalil, I was 10 years old, 1994. I remember hearing about the incident and wondering, is the Israeli army going to help support us? Right? That was the only army I knew of. We did not have a Palestinian military. And I remember thinking, well, they're supposed to protect people. They're an army. We need protection. We need safety. We were just wronged. There was this horrific massacre. But you start to also gain some of the answers to these questions as you're growing up under occupation. And what I learned in that moment was the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli occupation forces were never there to protect us. They would never guarantee our safety, our livelihood. And what they in fact did was they announced a curfew. And so this was one of the very first times in my life I understood what man'at tajawwal, or a curfew, was. And essentially, we had military orders because we lived under a military occupation that we could not go outside, we could not fraternize, we could not go to school. And this happened for a couple of weeks. And so everything shut down. I didn't have school, didn't have times to go outside and play with my friends, my neighbors, with my family members. We were essentially all sitting ducks waiting in our homes for the IDF to conduct their raids, for them to continue to brutalize and criminalize our people. Those are just just a couple of the memories that stick out from a few years of living under occupation back in Palestine.
Just to go back really quick to the difference between Tel Aviv and, let's just say, Ramallah or any other area, they're two different worlds. People don't realize Tel Aviv, I even tell people it's like Miami almost. It's a completely different world. You just see things completely different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was growing up at that point, lower middle class, I would say, in the US. I say that to say that it's not like we, wanted for anything. We didn't yearn for anything. Our basic needs were met. We weren't wealthy, but because we were in that middle class bucket, like I knew what it was to go to a skating ring with my friends. I knew what it was to go to a movie theater. I attended a summer camp, which was right down the street from where I grew up. And so there were like these things that, were just normal to me. And when I landed in Tel Aviv, I saw that again, it was built up. There were movie theaters, there was shopping malls, there was a beach that people would frequent in Jaffa. And so it just seemed to be much more closely representative of what I had saw in the United States. But then you drive out from Tel Aviv, and again, you notice that the roads in Al Khalil and Dura were not paved. You notice that the infrastructure is not the same. I can remember as a child when we were in Dura, Al Khalil, in my grandfather's home, there's no hot water, right? And now what your grandmother is doing, Jiddati, is she's heating water on the stovetop for me to take a bath. There was just so many like little things, whether it was TVs or entertainment or the lack of infrastructure in your schools, the lack of resources for your schools. It was just very apparent to me every day from that moment we left the airport in Tel Aviv that Al Khalil was not seeing the same investment in the livelihood of the people that Tel Aviv was seeing.
Yeah. Have you run into Jesse Jackson again throughout the years at any point?
I did actually. When we co-founded the Dream Defenders in 2012, in response to Trayvon Martin, we started taking a lot of direct action and a lot of prominent action calling for justice for Trayvon Martin. And one of the things we did was when George Zimmerman was acquitted on all charges, we occupied the Florida state capitol. And at the time, Rick Scott was the governor, and we occupied that Florida state capitol for 31 days and 30 nights. And we essentially made it the people's house. What we were saying was, if Rick Scott and the government of the state of Florida cannot serve the people and achieve justice for Trayvon Martin, that we were going to do that as the Dream Defenders. And so we took over the state capitol and actually had breakfast, lunch, and dinner served for people while we ran workshops, like day round workshops around zero tolerance policies in schools and how they criminalize young Black and brown people. We talked about racial profiling. We talked about stand your ground laws and how all of these things were threatening the future of people of color in the state of Florida. And we started to see visitors from all across the US. And one of those visitors was Jesse Jackson. And so I had a really cool moment where Jesse needed a Dream Defenders t-shirt. I took the t-shirt right off of my back. I went and grabbed another t-shirt and I gave Jesse my t-shirt. And when we did that, I had a moment with him and I said, "Hey, Jesse, I wanted to show you this picture." And I showed him the picture of me, him, and my parents right outside of that event in Al Khalil. I don't remember, too much of the conversation. I just remember we both thought it was really cool that we were reconnecting after all these years. And shout out to Jesse Jackson and all the elders really that, done the grueling organizing and activist work for us to be here doing what we do today.
But before Trayvon Martin, there was Martin Lee Anderson. So you sort of had the blueprint on how to navigate these situations years before, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, Martin Lee Anderson for me was a pivotal moment in my development as a human being, but also as an activist and an organizer. At that point in time, we're talking about 2005, 2006. I was student body vice president at Florida State University. I very much knew of myself as a leader, but I think that I had only scratched the surface. At that point in time, the campaigns that I was organizing, that I had led around, were tuition freeze campaigns, making sure tuition is affordable for students, making sure the computer lab would remain open 24/7, making sure printing was free at the computer lab for students. So it was very much like campaigns completely related to and revolving around the student experience in the university system and at Florida State University. But we heard about this story. A young boy named Martin Lee Anderson collapsed and was pronounced dead in a juvenile boot camp in Bay County, Florida. And we were all sort of like looking for more information. And then we heard about the autopsy report being released stating that Martin Lee Anderson died due to complications from sickle cell anemia. And as I was learning from my Black comrades at the time, like the sickle cell trait, which is present in many African Americans, couldn't on its own lead to the death of a Black American individual. There had to be some sort of exacerbating condition. And so I'm learning all this. We're trying to gain more facts, gain more information. And then I don't remember exactly how, but a video recording was released that actually showed guards in this juvenile boot camp beating this young boy to death. They literally showed him collapsing on the ground, and they tried to resuscitate him, but it didn't work. His body just gave out. He couldn't take it anymore. And that for me, like, resonated so deeply as a Palestinian, because, you know, whether it was the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre or other instances of violence from the IDF, from the Israeli settlers, I was so used to no justice being done. I was so used to cover up and moving on. It really felt like at that point in time, I needed to step up my activism. I needed to step up my dedication and my action for Martin Lee Anderson. And, you know, thankfully, I had a lot of comrades to learn from and lean on in that moment. So we launched a campaign, students from Florida State University, FAMU, which is an HBCU that was about a mile away from my campus, and Tallahassee Community College. And that was actually the first time I occupied the Florida State Capitol, and that was under Governor Jeb Bush. One more point I always try to make note of when I think about this moment is that it was a full circle moment in a way that I actually hadn't considered until years later. When we first went to occupy the governor's office, they told us that Jeb Bush was actually unavailable because he was in Iraq and he was supporting his brother's war in Iraq. And our immediate response was, we're going to wait. We'll sit and wait until he comes back because it's time to govern. I think really in hindsight, it was crazy because it's just like the conversation we're having today, where we're looking for our elected officials to solve the problems that we have domestically. We're looking for them to provide the resources that we have and need domestically to serve our communities, to provide for our communities, to provide justice when an injustice occurs. But so many times our leaders are focused on their wars abroad, whether it was Iraq and Afghanistan in that moment, or currently where we have all of this turmoil domestically, and we continue to see arms and support going to the state of Israel. So we learned a lot of lessons in that moment, and lessons I still draw from today.
So one way or another, you were always being pulled into something that led to resistance. I think that's what's so fascinating about your story. You also gravitated, from my understanding, to the Black and Latino community and your classmates, which I understand just from where I grew up, and that likeness of struggle and challenges and racism and hate and so on and so forth that we face. What was your experience with that, and what helped you gravitate?
Yeah, I mean, so I spent, as we mentioned, probably from the age 7 to 12, mostly in Palestine. And that's kind of when the blinders came off for me. I started to learn more about systemic oppression, about structural oppression and discrimination. And so I kind of came back to the United States, no longer believing in this perfect utopian society that I thought it was when I was 7. Again, you're talking about lower middle class. I had friends from different racial backgrounds in elementary school before we left. I had no idea what folks were dealing with. We didn't have those critical conversations at the age of 5 or 6 or 7. So I remember leaving America thinking it was perfect. And then when I came back, not only did I know what oppression felt like as a Palestinian, it became really clear to see what that looked like for communities here in the United States. And so I would pick up on the little things, like just how my Black classmates versus my white classmates, or my Latino classmates versus my white classmates, were treated by teachers, by principals, by administrative officials at the school, the same way, like, you know, we all have that class clown that we sort of laugh about and enjoy shaking things up. But the way that some folks were actually criminalized in playing that role versus others were laughed at and things moved on. So I started to notice the way folks were criminalized in school. But then I also started to notice like poverty and criminalization outside of the school. So because I had family members that had corner stores in primarily Black neighborhoods, I got a chance to see a lack of investment in infrastructure, a lack of investment in resources, very similar to, it took me back to what I thought when I first saw Al Khalil. When we first drove out to Al Khalil, I started to think like, why is it that certain neighborhoods just don't see the sort of investment, time, and attention in a caring way, in a communal way that other communities see? And so I saw poverty, I saw drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and I saw criminalization in a very real way in the communities that my family was working in.
And I know many people laid the groundwork, and we can shout out those individuals. But I think in a modern day sense, you've been putting Black and Palestinian liberation united at the forefront. Although it was done many years ago, I think people has forgotten, and now they're seeing it again. And I give you credit and Linda's Resort credit as well for really making that happen.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when I first started to do this work, I never imagined that it would be received in this manner. I think many times in life, we're told to temper down a bit. We're told to hold back some of the things that we envision or dream about. And it could have very easily been not received as well. And so I'm just really thankful that all of the Black folks, the Latino folks, the Native American folks that I've been able to be in relationship with in this movement were receiving of that message, of that vision of a united front against injustice, a united front for liberation. And so I'm just honestly honored, deeply honored to be a part of a legacy, a part of decades of tradition when it comes to the Black radical tradition and the Palestinian liberation movement. And, the point you make about other folks having laid the groundwork, that's absolutely true. They taught us so much. What was really cool for me was an experience I had with my father that I want to mention. I was gearing up for my first delegation to Palestine. So 2015, when I took Mark Lamont Hill and Patrice Cullors and Aja Monet and Phil Agnew, right before I crossed from Amman into Palestine for that delegation, I had a chance to spend an evening with my father, grab dinner, and I was reading a book, and he was like, "What are you reading?" And I pulled out the book, and it was a book on Stokely Carmichael, AKA Kwame Ture. I was just proclaiming to my father how dope I thought Stokely was. I was like, did you know about this guy? It wasn't just the Black Panther Party. And I was just learning about this Black radical tradition and their relationship to Palestine. And I was really loving and enjoying this book. And then my father pauses and he says, like, Stokely. And the way he said the name, I could tell like there was a connection there. And I found out literally that night before crossing over to Palestine that my father had actually organized with Stokely and other Palestinian comrades in DC. And there used to be this annual like African Liberation Day that Stokely and other Black organizers would hold. And they would gather with Palestinian folks in the lead up to that action. And there was a really strong relationship, so much so that they literally like shared plates of magluba together. And so for me, that was another full circle moment where, a lot of times you think you're trending in a direction or a pathway that you've charted yourself, and that could be the case. And also many times the pathway that we're down is also guided and influenced by others. It was really cool to have that sort of connective moment with my father.
What other role models did you have? I'm assuming Malcolm X was one of them. Mahmoud Darwish, I read, is another one possibly. By the way, very few people can quote Malcolm and then quote Mahmoud. That's dope that you're able to do that, just FYI.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X was huge for me. I hear the same from so many activists today. And it's just a testament to the profound impact that Malcolm can have on our lives, that he was taken from us decades ago. And we're still sort of inspired by his clarity. Like when I think about Malcolm X, I think about the brilliance, but what I also think about is right before he would start to speak, and I forget if it was the same person at every time or someone else from his team that would tell him, make it plain, right? Because like we could use all these grandiose words and, show how smart we are and intelligent we are. But Malcolm understood his mission was to actually make it plain and accessible. His mission was to make sure that the average Black American understood not only their role in the fight for justice domestically, but they're part of a international Black movement for liberation and justice connected back to Africa and of course connected back to the Middle East, to the Arab world. And so that, of course, opened up my learning to Zionist logic, his piece after he had visited Gaza and sort of loudly proclaiming his solidarity with Palestine and with Arabs for liberation of Palestine, not a mealy-mouthed, both sides sort of objective. He was very clear who he stood with. And, Malcolm just, continues to teach us. So anytime I'm able to read a new piece about Malcolm, read a new piece from Malcolm, a new doc, I'd love to just dig right into that. And Mahmoud Darwish, obviously the famed poet of the Palestinian people, someone that we resonate with in so many ways. But I think about when we took that first delegation to Palestine in 2015, we had a chance to sort of visit the museum in Ramallah and engage with some of his poetry. And there was a particular poem that's just resonated so deeply with me. I'm forgetting the exact words, but basically the translation was like, I'm not a traveler and my home is not a suitcase. And I started to think about all the people, who left in 48 or left in 67 or left in 2014, who left in 2021, who are leaving now, who have left in the last year and a half. And, that's not home for us. Home is Palestine. Home is a liberated Palestine. And we're going to return and we're going to settle in our lands, in our ancestral lands, and we're going to rebuild Palestine in the vision of the Palestinian people. And Darwish was able to connect with us all in the story of a Palestinian refugee yearning for home.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but other than your father, we're going to say, and then Mahmoud Darwish, who was your main influence as a Palestinian in Palestine, specifically a Palestinian? The last time I asked this question, I had to beep out the answer. So hopefully I don't have to do it this time.
Yeah. Look, for me, it was, a lot of the times just the average everyday Palestinian that I saw, like in my family, my uncles, my aunts doing what they needed to do in spite of life under occupation. It just fascinates me that our people can endure such devastation, such heartache, such brutality. And like very similar to that Rafif Ziada line, like we teach life, people back home just embody that in such a very real way. So I would say like really my time there, I was just fascinated by the fact that our people can take every single punch that the Israelis can give us and continue to proceed on. Once I learned more and more, I think it's hard not to be inspired by Hasan Kanafani. I think so many times in these days, we're searching for clarity. And so many of our leaders in those days had that clarity. So sometimes you're searching for an answer and you're trying to look forward, but sometimes it's all about looking back. And Hasan Kanafani absolutely comes to mind.
And I want to give you your flowers here. You talked about Malcolm X using plain language and simplifying it. And I actually find that fascinating about you. I think we could put you in any scenario with any race, religion, whatever it may be, and you're able to adapt and speak in a language or in a way that people will understand and appreciate.
Hey, man, thank you, bro. I think, one, I appreciate you. Thank you for everything you're doing and for offering the flowers. I think we got to do a better job at that. Just giving our people their flowers, making sure our people know they're loved and appreciated and supported. And also we got to do a better job. And it's really difficult to say in this time, but a better job of taking stock of our wins, right? So when, one of these students that was abducted in the middle of the night gets released, right? That's a win for us. When our people had those few moments of relief from the bombs and the devastation, that was a win for us. And when we're going to be able to get some aid into our people that are suffering and in need of necessary aid, that will be a win for us. And it's not the ultimate win. It's not the North Star win, but we have to appreciate, again, the gains that we're making in spite of the most powerful militaries in the history of the planet, in spite of the most powerful lobbies in the history of the planet, in spite of the billions and trillions of dollars invested in opposing us. we continue on. I really appreciate it. I think this is a moment for us to lean in and everyone do whatever they can. And it looks differently for each of us. And if my ability to convey a message can help bring more people into our movement, I'm going to keep conveying that message until my last breath.
And just the theme of giving flowers, you've successfully upset 3 different governors in Florida: Jeb Bush, Rick Scott, and DeSantis later on. And that's really my segue into the Dream Defenders. You talked about when it was created, but I couldn't wrap my mind around you creating it. You were in college? Is that right? Or was that law school at that time?
Yeah, we co-founded the Dream Defenders right after I graduated law school. Many of the comrades that we co-founded the organization with had been folks that I organized with around Martin Lee Anderson. So it wasn't a complete overlap, but there was plenty of overlap. I had just finished law school. I had just passed the bar exam, and I was grappling with what sort of lawyer did I want to be? What sort of career did I want to chart? While in law school, I had an internship at the International Criminal Court in the office of the chief prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo. I remember walking into that internship, my dream being, I will one day prosecute Benjamin Netanyahu at the ICC. And I'm sure plenty of Palestinian law students going with that same dream. Like, I want that motherfucker on trial. That's the only reason I'm here. But what I learned in that internship is that these structures are so imperfect if I want to be kind, but just useless if I want to use stronger terminology. And I remember being in meetings. My father was then the Palestinian ambassador to the Netherlands, and he was in meetings with the chief prosecutor. And the PA was making the case that the Rome Treaty, the ICC should exercise jurisdiction over the occupied territories and therefore allow for us to make a claim at the ICC about Israeli war crimes. And I just remember sitting there listening on the conversation of the chief prosecutor explaining to the PA and my father that, it's a black hole, right? Because Israel hasn't signed on to the treaty. Palestine isn't a recognized state. And so I just remember thinking, like, what the fuck is the purpose of the ICC if someone can literally commit colonization, ethnic cleansing, and now what we're witnessing to be genocide and not do anything about it because that nation didn't avail themselves of your jurisdiction? I mean, it just literally pissed me off so much that I decided during that internship, I didn't want to be a part of the internal. And I understand the strategy between an internal and an external, but I decided basically then that I was going to be on the outside. I wanted to be a part of movement, influencing these institutions, pushing these institutions. But I didn't want anything to do with having to be that person in the meeting to tell people oppressed that, hey, sorry, just it doesn't fit for us because of this technicality. So all that to say, when I had finished law school and passed the bar exam, I knew more about what I didn't want to do as a lawyer than I knew what I did want to do. And when we heard the story about Trayvon Martin being murdered, I reconnected with all of my comrades from the Martin Lee Anderson Coalition for Justice. And we started to have real conversations around the fact that we needed to create something more stable. We needed to create something more long lasting and more impactful. And so this wasn't a new student group that we were going to create. It was a group that could be engaged in community across the state of Florida. And so we decided to found the Dream Defenders. And in that first call where we decided we would found the Dream Defenders, we wanted to do a march very similar to the march from Selma to Montgomery that Dr. King and his comrades had taken. We wanted a 40-mile march from Bethune-Cookman to Sanford, Florida, where Trayvon was killed. And then, one of the funny moments we always like to mention is on that call, one of the brothers who was on there was like, yeah, and, even if it takes us a few hours to march there, we'll do it, And I just remember thinking, like, a few hours, like, brother, it's going to take us days to get to Sanford. But that was the birth of Dream Defenders. And the last thing I'll say about it is I wore a keffiyeh to that initial march. And that march is actually covered, and some of Dream Defenders' inception is covered in the newest Eyes on the Prize documentary on HBO. So definitely want to shout that out. Appreciate those folks for documenting Dream Defenders, making sure we're a part of that legacy. But I wore a keffiyeh around my shoulders those first couple of days of the march, even though it was sweltering heat, summertime Florida, because it just felt very organic. It wasn't like, I need for Palestine to be front and center. It just felt like it should be something I wear when I'm going on this march. And that sparked a lot of conversations that allowed me to understand that a bunch of the people co-founding the Dream Defenders already understood, already knew a lot about Palestine and the parallels, but also that it was an opportunity for me to educate and share with those who didn't. So over those 3 days, 40 plus miles of marching, sleeping on church floors, sitting on the side of a road, catching a breath and a drink of water, I was able to really have some deep conversations with folks around their experience with state-sanctioned violence as Black folks, as Latino folks, as undocumented folks here in the state of Florida, and basically sharing what I knew and learned about Palestine.
I think that group first, if I remember correctly, also threw their support behind BDS. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. One of our first campaigns that received unanimous support. I mean, we literally took it to a vote at our conference that year. It received unanimous support from our membership. I think that it was the foundational understanding that they had about Palestine. It was the parallels that they saw between the Black experience here, the indigenous experience here, and the experience of Palestinians back home. But it was also like the historic relationship that our movements have had here, the Black radical tradition has had here with boycotts. How do we have some strategy and some economic impact behind our demands? How do we hit them where it hurts? And so thinking again about how Dream Defenders was inspired by Dr. King and this legacy of the Black radical tradition, boycotts were fully within that. And so it was beautiful to see. And I remember that day in that vote, and we had 3 Palestinian comrades that came to join us that day for the conference. And to see how excited they were in that moment was also a beautiful thing.
Appreciate the invite, man. Thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah. So I bring that up too, because DeSantis actually used Dream Defenders as a way to discredit his opposition, I believe, during one of the governor's races, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, DeSantis took a liking to us, is one way to put it. I was really shocked at the evidence they used in sort of piecing together their claim. But they basically found a bunch of pictures that we took from different delegations. They made accusations about some of the people that we met with, and then they pieced it together to make it seem like there was some deep level connection between Andrew Gillum and the PFLP. And they started to write in different right-wing news sources claiming that I myself was a member of the PFLP and that Andrew Gillum running for governor wished me happy birthday on Facebook. So it's a very scandalous, just a very scandalous relationship there that we had to the candidate for governor, which, by the way, we did have a relationship to Andrew Gillum. He was a activist, a organizer with Young People for America. He had a relationship with many of us from our days in Tallahassee. He was a former FAMU student body president and activist on his campus. And so that relationship, that was factual. But what wasn't factual is I, in fact, was not and am not a member of the PFLP. But, it was pretty funny and flattering at some point, except for the fact that is literally what they use now as evidence to repress, disappear, and abduct students. It's this faulty, weaved together story that they tell that, unfortunately, again, is leading to real criminalization of our people at this moment. So that was really interesting to see DeSantis come at us directly.
PFLP, can you break that acronym down for the audience and the listeners?
Yeah, that's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It is a leftist, Marxist-Leninist Palestinian faction that engaged in armed struggle. And so that's why DeSantis was making that claim, because if they could make the claim that we were a part of this internationalist, communist, leftist, armed resistance to U.S. interests, then they could criminalize us. And that was the attempt, is to make that sort of material support for terrorism connection that they're making much more prominently today via the Trump administration.
Yeah. And I also just want the audience to know, you also worked with Iraqi refugees as well. If you could just talk about, because again, the theme here, resistance, and you're always giving to the community and supporting the community, no matter what country they're from, what their background is or religion, you're always there to support.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I actually forgot about that for a second myself. But while I was in law school, I worked in our immigration law clinic, and I was in law school in Jacksonville, Florida. And of course, like it being in law school between the years of 2008 to 2011, there were a lot of Iraqi refugees resettling in the US because of the Iraq war. And so this is again another point for us to take a step back and understand the connections between US imperialism abroad and then issues like immigration and services and resources here domestically. But yeah, I was really proud in that moment to be using my legal skill set, to be using the resources that my law school had provided in the Jacksonville community to guide these Iraqi families to their citizenship process, which, you know, as an immigrant, I think there's a very real relationship, a love-hate relationship, I would say, with the United States. Our people came here, many of them with nothing, many of them only with what they could carry on their backs, coming to a country that has offered opportunity, that has offered opportunity for our families. My father was educated in this country. I was educated in this country. We've used those skill sets to do whatever we can to support our people. And it's also true that this country, through imperialism and through its foreign policy, has devastated our communities. It has devastated Iraq. It's devastated Palestine. It's devastated Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And I think we have to be able to hold that and say, like, there are things in this country we absolutely appreciate, we have benefited from, and we have a truth to be told. We have a story that needs to be told around how U.S. foreign policy and imperialism has actually driven us to need to resettle here.
And I think that's going to be a great segue to USCPR. But before we get there and your current organization, you did take a brief detour, I think for a few years, to Dearborn, Michigan.
Yeah. And I'm really thankful for that opportunity. Dearborn, Michigan has a big place in my heart. You know, growing up Palestinian in South Florida, I didn't have a high concentration of Arabs, Muslims, etc. around me growing up. It was literally me and my family. And I'm thankful for those opportunities with family, but Dearborn, Michigan was something else. It's a beautiful community. I really have some lifelong relationships that mean a lot to me there. And I've actually been back to visit so many times, which I was shocked by initially that I would be coming back to Dearborn, Michigan so many times, but that place means a lot to me. I had an opportunity to live there from 2017 until late 2019, actually until late 2020. I worked for some time at Access, leading the National Network for Arab American Communities, changed my life. And now I have, again, some lifelong relationships, friendships, dear people to me in Dearborn, Michigan. And, you know, I think Michigan made us all proud, right? Michigan made us really proud in this last election cycle, not because some people voted for Trump. Absolutely not. That's not a part of it. I don't know what our people were thinking for those who voted for Trump, but I think that community being able to stand up and say, not so fast. Like, no, this issue of Gaza, of Palestine, this war means everything to us. And we're going to take some unpopular hits with some people, but it was important for Dearborn and for that really beautiful Arab community to stand up and, you know, Uncommitted and all the different efforts from there were really inspiring.
Between me and you, keep it real. Did you leave Dearborn because you couldn't handle the weather in the wintertime?
That's absolutely why I left, man. Look, the first year there, I lived in Detroit the first year, right by Wayne State. And then I actually lived in the east end of Dearborn. But there was a night my first year there where it was negative 20 degrees. Okay. It was negative 20 degrees. I was like, what the fuck? I can't deal with this. I remember there was a day where I came outside. My car was just engulfed in snow from every direction. I was so unprepared. And I joke about it, but it was very real. We joke about white saviors. I had real white saviors that day because these 3 white kids that probably were Wayne State students walked right by me and they said, "Excuse me, sir, do you need some help?" And I looked up and I was like, "Thank you, God." Like, oh, you know, thank you. Alhamdulillah, Ya Rab. And they helped me shovel my car out of snow that day. And so there were some growing pains. I love Dearborn, but yeah, I cannot live there because exactly of that weather.
Yeah, I hear that. So talk about your transition to the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights. Before you do that, I want to say, I don't believe you all get the love that you should be getting or the attention that you should be getting. I think people know a little bit about you all. Maybe we've seen it across a website or some sort of advertisement for some event that's going on. I asked a couple of my colleagues, do you know what they do exactly? And the answer was no, but we know they do good work. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So firstly, thank you for that. I think USCPR, just like several other Palestinian organizations, don't get the credit they deserve. And I think part of that is like we're all sort of disconnected and fragmented. And, we've been fragmented intentionally as a people, right? Our people in Gaza and the West Bank. And then there's also the fragmentation with those of us in the diaspora. And then, of course, you just have new orgs sprouting up every single day. So I think there's a lot of valid reasons. Some we should interrogate deeper, but a lot of valid reasons for why USCPR or others aren't gaining the credit or getting the credit that they should be receiving. But what the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights North Star goal is to end all military aid to the state of Israel from the U.S. It was initially founded as the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. And it was founded by folks like Nadia Hijab, Phyllis Bennis. And one thing I'm always proud to share is they were also in consultation with Edward Said. Like he was helping to inform the strategy of what they were building. And what they knew they needed to build was a vehicle for people here in the United States, the belly of the beast, the heart of empire, to say no, not with our tax dollars, not with our support, not in our name. And so they created the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. And at some point, the leadership of the org prior to me joining decided, you know what, rather than focusing the name, the title, the strategy on what we're against, we do want to center Palestinians more and the vision of Palestinians more. And that's when it became the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights. I always had a profound level of respect for USCPR from afar. We had worked with them on a couple of initiatives while I was at the Dream Defenders. People like Yusuf Munayir and Rama Kudaimi and Josh Rubner, Phyllis Bennis and Nadia Hijab, who I mentioned earlier. There were so many people that actually had served either on the staff or the steering committee of the U.S. campaign that I had such profound respect for, and I learned a lot from. So when I saw that Yusuf was actually leaving the U.S. campaign, I couldn't believe the opportunity that was ahead of me. Obviously not knowing that I would get the job, but I felt very aligned in the sense that this role is speaking to me. I didn't want to be conceited, but I sort of felt like, hey, I don't think anyone else can do a better job than me at this organization in this moment. And it was because I recognized through the delegation work I did at Dream Defenders, through the sort of cross-movement solidarity work I had done, that I had an impact. I had an impact in bringing people to the movement and allowing for people to make their connection to Palestine. Even when I was at Access and the National Network for Arab American Communities, my time was always limited as to what I could dedicate to Palestine. And so I felt very aligned with this stage of my life, this time of my life, all these skills that I had built up, this experience that I had built up. It was now time for me to dedicate that fully to Palestine. So while I completely believe in the missions of the National Network and Dream Defenders and many of the other orgs that I had touched during my time, it was the moment for me to be intentional, focused, and devoted to our cause and our people. And it just so happened to line up that the U.S. campaign was looking for a new executive director.
First, shout out to Phyllis Bennis. She was a previous guest on the podcast. Second thing, what you said resonated with me deeply because shifting our focus 100% to Palestine is the same concept of the podcast. I think it's time for us. This is what our parents brought us here for, right? This is game time, and this is what we got to do. So I really do appreciate that. Did the Jewish National Fund sue you all before you joined or after?
Yeah. See, one of the things that I've been dealing with a lot these days is lawsuits and potential lawsuits. No matter how far I try to stray away from legal stuff, it just pulls you back in. The Jewish National Fund sued the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, alleging material support to terrorism. And their case was obviously bullshit. It was eventually dismissed after a couple of years of wonderful legal support and anxiety for people on our team. But their case was essentially claiming that we supported the Great March of Return, which we did. Those were people from Gaza who were nonviolently marching back to their homes, and they were met with gunfire, snipers, all sorts of Israeli weaponry. And so we obviously supported that Great March of Return. But apparently during the Great March of Return, there had been some balloons that apparently emanated from Gaza and then ended up on some of the settlers' lands. And these balloons set fire to some of their crops. And so imagine, with all of the clear evidence of Israeli settlers burning olive trees and setting our crops on fire and destroying our land, imagine getting a lawsuit with this sort of accusation. But the other layer to their accusation was that the U.S. campaign for some time had served as the fiscal sponsor for the BNC. The BNC is the Boycott National Committee, the central body for the BDS movement. And we did, in fact, serve as the fiscal sponsor of the BNC. But their claim was actually that because we had that official relationship to the BNC, which then has an official relationship to the Coalition of Islamic Organizations in Palestine, which has a relationship to XYZ organizations, they were claiming that we, in fact, had direct relationship to certain armed resistance groups. So add it all up, it's a bunch of bullshit. Thankfully, again, we had great lawyers and the judge was able to see that. And so that lawsuit was dismissed, thankfully, so that we could focus on other lawsuits.
It was actually wrapped up in 2024, but it was going on for years. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. As soon as I joined the organization, it was something that I had to take on. And it was dismissed at the lower level. And then, of course, there was an appeal. And so that's why it was finally done away with, I believe, in the beginning of 2024, because at that point in time, the highest review court or appeals court affirmed the lower court's decision to dismiss the lawsuit. And so we felt really good about that because we knew that more of these sort of attacks were coming, and it felt like one less thing to worry about in the moment.
First things first, I find it ironic that they're claiming that the balloons in Gaza created fires and burned their crops when those very individuals are actually burning our crops with their own two hands. So that's fascinating. There's this concept of lawfare. I think that's what you're referring to, that you're constantly under attack with lawsuits and whatever that may be. When does that run out? When does that strategy just stop working? Or is it that they have so much money that they can just keep hitting everybody with lawsuits?
It depends how they define success. And I think probably there's a number of things that they would define as a success in launching these lawfare attacks at us. I think there is the point of success where they actually can get people prosecuted. They can get tax exempt status removed. They can get institutions shut down. And that would probably be their ideal goal for many of these lawfare attacks. But there's also like those secondary goals that they have: to take us off of our A game, to take our foot off the gas pedal, to tie up our resources, time, funding with lawyers and conversations with lawyers. There's a very intentional effort to stifle our movement, to slow us down. And that's where I think really they probably would continue to invest as much resources as they have in lawfare, because the reality is, even though I hate it, even though I know it's a part of what their goal is, I still need to dedicate a certain percentage of my time weekly to talk to lawyers. Now, I do my best to prioritize and be as intentional as possible with keeping, again, my focus on our people that are starving, being starved, and experiencing famine in Gaza. Also, our folks in the West Bank experiencing ethnic cleansing and criminalization. These things are very real to me. But if we don't protect the institution, if we don't secure the house, we're not going to be able to do that work. Or we will, but it'll just look differently. And so the other thing for us is like, okay, it's like preparing for the attacks, responding to attacks, but also envisioning structures beyond the 501c3, envisioning structures beyond the 501c4, the LLCs, the PACs. We really just need to do our due diligence to prepare, to envision, but ultimately to try to keep that bucket as limited as we can so that we can devote our time, attention, and resources elsewhere where it's needed, our people on the ground.
Right on. And just going back to the UN, there was a full circle moment for you, if I'm not mistaken, 2021. You got to actually speak at the UN?
Yeah, I've gotten to speak at the United Nations a couple of times. The most recent time was actually in October of 2023. We had an opportunity to make clear that the United States was not making right its duties under the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because we knew that the repression of the Palestine movement, the repression of Palestinian students and activists in the midst of a genocide was extremely problematic and something that needed our attention. And so the most recent time I was able to go to Geneva and be a part of efforts to call out the United States for its direct role in the genocide and the repression that we were seeing stateside was actually in October of 2023. Again, it's really wild, being in certain spaces while your people are under bombardment, while they're being starved. And I think we need reminders at times, even as Palestinians, that our focus should be our people on the ground, but we can't cede any territory. We can't cede any ground. We can't let them have any United Nations committee hearings, any Senate hearings, any congressional hearings, any state-based hearings without making clear that Palestine is a part of those conversations. And in the many ways it should be a part, whether it's like divesting from war and investing in our communities, whether it's around the fight for democracy, freedom of speech and repression, Palestine needs to be inserted in every single one of those circles. And that's what me and some really dope people were communicating in Geneva.
All right. I don't want to get in trouble with Berea here. So I got to ask, not my tax dollars. What is that all about? What does that program look like and what resources are associated with it? And we're going to show it on the screen for the YouTube audience as well.
Yeah. I mean, Not My Tax Dollars is an opportunity for us to take ownership as taxpayers in the United States to make clear that not only do we oppose the use of our tax dollars and U.S. weapons and U.S. manufacturing in genocide, right? This is something that is actually a clear violation, not only of international law, but of U.S. law. And the issue is no one wants to hold Israel accountable. And of course, the U.S. government doesn't want to hold itself accountable. But there's that part of it. But there's also the other end of it that, we live in communities that are continuously divested from. What do I mean by that? I mean, we're literally right now watching the Trump administration shutting down everything from DEI initiatives to funding for different services and departments, shutting down entire services and departments. And so Not My Tax Dollars is both on one end, an opportunity for people here in the United States, taxpayers, to communicate their objection to the use of tax dollars for genocide, for ethnic cleansing, for violations of human rights. But it's also an opportunity for us to provide a new vision, a vision of funding care for our communities instead of harm. And so what we have with our Not My Tax Dollars website and map is a tool where the average taxpayer in Miami, in Nebraska, in New York, in Idaho can actually track and figure out how many federal tax dollars are being siphoned off from their state, from their county, and even from their city that's going to the state of Israel. And what could they have seen on the local level in the place of that military funding? So, it'll tell you, you could have hired this amount of teachers. You could have provided shelter for this amount of homeless people. You could have provided healthcare for this amount of young people that are living without healthcare. We have real needs here. The material day-to-day reality for the average taxpayer is worse than it's ever been in the history of this country. There's an opportunity now to make clear the contradictions for the average taxpayer and help them understand why ending funding to Israel is actually a part of us all getting free here, right? Like when we can provide for our people here and they have the housing, they have the sheltering, they have the education, they have the healthcare necessary, then this society can reach heights that we haven't seen yet.
And what's the best way for us to support this initiative? Because again, I think we need to do a better job of getting this out there, right? Just generally as a community. I mean, it's such an important resource. I'll be very honest with you, until your team mentioned it to me, I wasn't even aware of it. I'm pretty deep in this stuff too at this point. So
Yeah. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reasons. Some we need to interrogate, and some are just present for why we don't know enough about the work, about each other, about these resources that are out there. So thank you for making note of that. USCPR.org, notmytaxdollars.org, USCPRaction.org are some of our websites that folks can reach to find out more information about Not My Tax Dollars, and of course, any other initiatives or campaigns that USCPR is active on right now.
yeah, right on. And can you talk about the U.S. campaign for Palestinian Rights Action specifically?
Yeah, that is our C4 arm. As a 501c3, you're allowed to do up to a certain percentage of lobbying officials, whether that's on the state level or the federal level. A C4 has an unregulated amount of lobbying that you're able to accomplish. And so it's a structure that we've created out of necessity to make sure that we can actually do all the lobbying, all of the advocacy that we need to do on the local level, on the state level, on the national level. And the other thing C4s can do that C3s cannot do is endorse candidates. And so USCPR Action has not gotten to that point yet, but we'd like to be very involved in not only supporting and protecting candidates that have our back, that are champions of this issue, folks like Rashida Tlaib, right? We envision USCPR Action also down the line being active in taking out incumbents that don't support and replacing them with folks that do support our movement. This is the investment that we want to make politically to make sure that we're eliminating the amount of spaces that Palestine is not welcome in, that we are making sure Palestine is present in every level. Because again, our people don't have the luxury for us to cede any organizing space, for us to cede any advocacy space. So USCPR Action allows for us to do all of that lobbying and engagement work with candidates that we need to do to make sure that this is a part of a long-term fight for justice.
And how do we support USCPR, generally speaking? What's the best way to go out there and support your cause and the work that you're doing?
Well, I mean, signing up on our email list and our social media and following our communications will allow for you to understand both what we're up to and how you can plug in. Because the reality is it looks differently for every person. Some folks may have 10 minutes of free time in their day. Some folks may have a few hours. And so we don't have a one size fits all agenda here. What we want to do at USCPR is if you sign up via our mailing list, our social media, we want you to be able to identify which bucket of work makes the most sense for you. In the last couple of weeks, we've had people take action and call university presidents and demand that they protect our students, they protect our SJPs. We've had a call tool where folks can call their members of Congress and let people know that we absolutely oppose the starvation and the famine that our people in Gaza are enduring right now directly because of U.S. complicity and U.S. involvement. You'll be able to pick from a menu of items that you can take action with, and we'll have those tools readily available on our websites. You can also share all of that stuff with your loved ones, with your family members. You could do your own gathering and make sure people get active. You could do a power hour on your own. You could also donate to the organization. That's another opportunity for those that don't have as much time, right? Some folks that we know really love and care for Palestine deeply maybe can't find the time. They have families, they have obligations. And so they're like, which org can I support that has a mission and a vision that is in line with my politics? USCPR is that as well.
Any events coming up or anything that anybody can attend?
We're doing some events for Nakba Week with Rashida Tlaib and the IMU Policy Project. I think that's the first one that comes to mind, but I think if folks stay tuned with our social media, our websites, and our email list, they'll be able to be informed of any other upcoming events.
So I mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation that the goal is to release this episode on Nakba Day, on May 15th. I want you to give the message to the diaspora, to the people in Palestine, to the people in Gaza, just an overarching message for them.
The Nakba is both a catastrophe that exists in our history, in our hearts, in our minds, and it's actually also a catastrophe that we're witnessing in present day. While we gather in commemoration of the Nakba, I hope that we continue to find community amongst each other. I hope that we continue to find strategy and action amongst each other, because they're trying to finish the job of the Nakba. The opposition is clear, not only via their actions, but they're actually speaking out loud with a clarity about wanting to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. They want to retake Gaza. They want to annex the West Bank. And so what we know is that all of these things they're rolling out right now are a part of the continuation of the Nakba, attempting to isolate the Palestinian people, attempting to take our lands, attempting to erase us. They have that old quote that we've all heard, that the old will die and the young will forget. And I love to remind them that they're absolutely wrong about that. I love to remind them that we're coming for them. I love to remind all these Zionist institutions that we're tired of having the target on our back, and we're going to build power until we liberate Palestine, inshallah.
Beautiful message, Ahmed. I appreciate you so much. It's these kinds of conversations that sort of wake me up over and over again and inspires me to continue forward. So I do appreciate you spending time with me today. Any final words before we let you go?
Hey, man, this was a great conversation. Thank you, my brother. I appreciate you. Really appreciate your delving into the podcast game. It's not easy because people are kind of over podcasts. So I really appreciate you delving into this field to give our people more space to talk about these sorts of things, right? To have this sort of conversation. So appreciate you, my brother. Thank you for your work. I don't think I'll be in DC within the next few weeks, but when I do come out to DC, I'm gonna hit you up, man. We're gonna grab some coffee somewhere Palestinian, somewhere with some good food, and we'll
have you over for Mensa or something. We'll bring you over to the house.
Man, now you're speaking.
Yeah.
Now you're talking, my brother. Appreciate you, man.
Appreciate you.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.